I'm going to talk about where we are and our plans with FHIR, and I'm talking about FHIR as a product. So just to start with our release history, this is FHIR as a standard. When I look at FHIR as a product, I think about two parts. I think about the standard, and I think about community. The product is both those parts. The standard itself, which is the written trail of what we decided, we released release 1 in September 2014, then release 2, release 3 and release 4 on a gradually extending timescale as the scope of the work that we're taking on increased. Release 4, which we published in December last year, had our first normative content. So if we hold to that kind of schedule, we will be looking to publish release 5 sometime in October next year, maybe. We don't have that much flexibility in terms of the timing. We have a set of activities we have to go through, and so we can't really make it much quicker than that at the moment. Maybe further down the track we can change the way we behave, but it's pretty hard to change right now. So we'll probably be looking at October 2020. I'll come back to that. So first of all, I want to just repeat what normative means, because feedback is a lot of people in the community are not clear about this. So FHIR started its life as a very open, agile standard. But over time, as more and more people buy into the process, it becomes harder and harder to change, and then you start building significant amounts of national infrastructure based on FHIR, because it's really hard to change. And so the goal of the standard is to get to what we call normative, which is an American National Standards Institute terminology, so very arcane standards terminology. What it means is that we stand behind the standard and we don't make any breaking changes to it. So in theory, normative means no breaking change. In practice, what that means is actually forwards compatible. You'll often hear it called backwards compatible, but it's not. It's forwards compatible. If you write an application and the application conforms to release 4 normative portions, you have every expectation that it will continue to be conformant when we publish release 5, and you won't be forced to make changes. So that's forwards compatible. Your application will remain compatible. It's something slightly different to backwards compatibility. There's some limits around that. For instance, if you write your application and in your application you reject unknown elements, then your application will be not forward compatible. Well, it was your choice to do that. And that's something for you to think about when you're writing applications. But actually there's some parts and some corners of the specification where we don't really know exactly what it means to be forwards compatible. The FHIR specification does things that we haven't got institutional experience with in HL7. And so we don't really know what it means to not make breaking changes to them. And there's one qualification of that, which is that there's some features that we've published and called normative. We found out that no one's actually using this particular corner case. And so we'll feel free to ask everybody if they're using that corner case and then make a change. For instance, there's one point where we found we're missing a very obvious business rule, and technically introducing the business rule would be a breaking change, because an application that had been breaking that rule could claim that it was a standard, and in the future version it wouldn't be able to claim that. But if everybody in the world says, oh, we wouldn't do that, then we can make that rule. Okay, so you'll see some consultation around that kind of thing coming as we try and finalise release 5. But we can expect clarification of the ruling generally in release 5. And this is based on our maturity model. So when we add stuff to the spec, we add it at what we call level 0, which is the first draft that's added to the specification. And each artifact goes through a process where we gradually work it over to get more and more people to look at it, to argue about it, content, to test it. And then we get to trialing it in real-world implementations. And eventually, when we're really confident, we say, well, we're not going to make breaking changes anymore. Any of you who are sociologists, because you know the IT world is full of those, will recognise Tuchman's stages of group development: forming, storming, norming, performing. That's what's going on here. Each artifact has a community around it that goes through that process. And you can clearly see as you look through the history of the spec that everything that we introduced went through storming, where we argued about what we were even doing. And eventually it gets to the point where no one wants to change it anymore. And new people come in, look at it, go, hey, why is something here? And we all go, we're not changing that, whatever. And so that's that kind of social process. There's a law, by the way, that we know, HL7, we call it Rischel's law, after Wes Rischel, who first coined it, who's no longer, he's retired now. But Wes Rischel's law is that when you change the consensus group, you change the consensus. And that bedevils everything that we do, because as people gradually roll through, they come in and they move out, more new people come in, over time the consensus changes. And so people are asking us to be both agile and also to conserve what we've got. So there's an ongoing challenge for us there. But our general release 5 plan is to move everything along this list. It's to move everything along the list of maturity levels. And I'm actually going to do a cull later this year. I'm going to look at stuff and say, this is not moving through the maturity levels. Nobody's pushing it along. If nobody's pushing it along, why do we even have it? And so later this year, I'm going to propose a bunch of things to cull from the standard. That will be an interesting and passionate discussion. I'm sure we'll enjoy that. By the way, do feel free to ask, and Diego's over there with a microphone, so we can, if you want, just hands up and Diego will find you and run over there and you can ask me questions. All right. In the January meeting, I asked the committees to indicate what resources they have that are candidates for being normative. This is a long list of resources. Everybody is keen to bring stuff to normative to say it's done. This is too long. This is a contest, like a popularity contest, in effect, between these resources. So if you're interested in seeing some of these resources, there's 20-something of them, come to normative, you actually need to join the team and push it along by implementation and balloting on them and so forth. So you really need to think of this as a popularity contest. But we've said as a policy question that we'd like to see all the resources that support US CDI go normative. So we'll see how that process goes. So for some of them, it's clearly a big step up. For others, it's like, well, duh, it's very obvious. And if you're interested, that list is published on my product director's roadmap for release 5, which is publicly released. Yeah?
Why do you have a question mark in document reference?
I'll get to that one in a sec. It's a good question, and I'll come back to that. So our overall R5 agenda is moving content to normative, which I've just talked about. We want to further improve the support for publishing implementation guides, which is our myopic focus right now. We're going to add additional content in newly developing domains. And we're actually seeing a really bunch of interesting stuff in translational medicine, which I'll get to in a sec. We want to improve support for applications that use multiple FHIR releases seamlessly. I'm actually talking about that at the end of the day today. And also multi-language support, which is, we're going to have a pop-up session on language support. And we also need to improve our support for federated servers. And we also want to add more support for migrating data to and from V2 messages and CDA documents. I think I'm talking about that one tomorrow. Now, what we're actually going to do is we're going to survey the market in August this year. In August this year, we're going to go to all FHIR users, every member of HL7 and everybody else that we can find to ask through Twitter and direct emails and through all the affiliates and so forth, everyone in the world. We're going to ask them a series of questions how are you using FHIR, what resources are you using, and we're going to be asking about profiles and extensions. And particularly, we're going to be asking whether you have an opinion on when we should publish Release 5. When we published Release 4, a number of significant stakeholders came to us and said, we want you to stop and not work on Release 5 and just leave Release 4 as stable. And at the same time, other stakeholders said to us, oh, we're sending Release 4 out. We're waiting for you to get Release 5 out. So we want you to get Release 5 out as quick as possible. And this happened in the past, actually, when we published Release 2. A number of significant stakeholders said to us, we want you to stop and just leave Release 2 as the working release. So we said, well, we need to put some stuff out. So we'll do a patch and do 2.1. And then after about 8 months, everyone turned around and said, nah, we've changed our minds, let's get 3 out the door. So what we're going to do is survey everybody and ask whether we should go ahead and publish Release 5 on the October schedule next year, or whether we should actually hold off and wait. I don't know exactly how we'll process, because no doubt we'll get a bunch of people saying no and a bunch of people saying yes, another bunch of people saying maybe, not sure. So I don't know how we'll make sense of that, but that's what we're going to do. In August, you'll see a detailed survey come out. And so I encourage all of you to take part in the survey and to encourage everyone else to do the same. And also specifically, the committees have decided that they'd really like to rename medication statement to medication usage and document reference to content reference, possibly, although we're still discussing that choice of name. I'm exercising product director prerogative and saying that we will ask the stakeholders about those name changes, whether they believe that they're justified. Because I've had quite a bit of feedback saying, what the hell are you doing with that? So you'll see those things come out, and we may have some additional maturity model required questions. Because remember that if we make any breaking changes to a resource that has a maturity level over 4 or over, we will go to the market and say, if you're using it, tell us whether you agree with that. And in the past, we've done that. About half the time, people have said, yeah, that's a good change. And about half the time, they've said, are you kidding me? We're not doing that. So those are genuine questions. Okay. So more generally, we're still doing a lot of work around workflow patterns and trying to add additional quality and consistency to the resource definitions. If you follow the blog sphere or the Twitter sphere, you'll see there's open, ongoing discussion about that. It's not an easy space. Any consistency that we impose across the resources is necessarily consistency that we take away between the resource and the domain of discourse the resource covers. And that's not obviously a good value proposition. So we're continuing to work on that. And that's a fair bit of work is going into the infrastructure to support that process. And we're building up our work around patterns, and time is flying, so do have a look at what we're doing with patterns. We're encouraging design time consistency and also trying to support runtime code reuse. So if you're interested in those things, have a look at what we're doing with patterns. So mostly what we're actually doing now is building out implementation space. The spec itself is starting to become stable, and stability is our primary concern. We're making currently a deep investment in implementation guides in the ecosystem around helping people to make use of FHIR, multiple versions, multiple languages, and data transformation I already talked about. And we've identified a number of domain areas that we believe deserve particular focus. We have a joint project with DICOM around making images available to consumers and improving some related workflows around imaging. We're continuing to work, which we already are, but more work on biosurveillance, public health, morbidity and mortality reporting. We've got a very active project for prior authorization and financial processes provider payer, that's Da Vinci. We've got an active group working on genomic reporting and genomic analysis specifications. We're working more on translational science and interface between research and operational medicine. And I think we could be quite transformative in that space. At the moment, it's very much a manual transition across the border in either way. And I think there's a lot to be gained for the system by automating that. And we're trying to provide access to the consumer or to the Argonaut interface to the complete medical record. We're continuing to further develop the related specifications to FHIR. Smart App Launch will do another version of that. CDS hooks, FHIR cars, CQL, and bulk data, although bulk data is going to stop being something special after this iteration. It's just become part of FHIR. I think that's how it's going to play out. I want to tell you about the FHIR community process. Just a very brief introduction to this. We're introducing the FHIR community process. It's a set of basic open development design principles that we're going to ask everybody who develops public implementation guides to follow. If you're a company producing your own implementation guide to describe your own implementation, then this doesn't affect you. But if you're a consortium or a national standards body or another standards body, and you're proposing to publish a FHIR implementation guide to tell people how to implement FHIR for some particular use case in some particular jurisdiction, we want you to follow the community process. It's named after the Java community process. So there's a set of expectations around how you behave. Basic, open, transparent principles, open license, anybody can comment. Doesn't mean anybody reconciles comments, but anybody can comment, and there's a published way for how your implementation guide will be maintained, and you publish it through our standard publishing mechanism. If you're a participant, you get to sit at a coordination council where we let each other know about what work's going on. We're trying to minimise the amount of overlapping work that's inconsistent. And if you sign up to this as a participant, then you get to use a forthcoming FHIR community process trademark for your marketing material and your specifications. And it's basically a sign to the community that you're playing by the community rules around building a community rather than fracturing the community. We have a draft. We're rolling this out and talking to all of the target organisations I've put up there. HL7 basically already follows the process. We're just saying this is the minimum for anybody else. IHE pretty much follows the process, although they use different language. So it'll be about mapping from a common language to a specific language. So we're working on rolling that out. And then you, as implementers, you should be saying, once we've got that in place, you should be saying to anybody who's saying, here's an implementation guide, you should be saying, well, have you followed the FHIR community process? How can I know that you're somebody to listen to if you haven't done that? Now, you need towards the end, and we'll take some questions. We'll have plenty of time for discussion. But I thought you might be interested in my personal to-do list. Went through my to-do list and summarised the bits that were interesting to the community. And yes, this is about a third of my to-do list. I'm significantly concerned about clinical safety, and I'm intending to build up our capacity as a community to work on clinical safety. But let's have a quick survey. How many of you have read the safety checklist in the FHIR specification? Yeah, the percentage hasn't changed. For those of you who haven't, why have you not read the safety checklist in the FHIR specification? I'm going to guess that most of you never thought there might be such a thing and never looked for it. But now you know. Go and read the safety checklist. It's all the things we've found that people have screwed up. And all of them have direct patient safety ramifications. It's a set of advice to you for things that you should have thought of before you roll an application out to real patient data. And feedback from Cerner and Epic is nobody has any clue about this stuff. And patients die. It matters. So do check the safety checklist. We clearly need as a community to get better, a better consent process. Right now we have a bunch of capabilities, but I'm far from convinced that anybody anywhere in the world can make that actually work. And we need to work towards producing something that works. And one of the things we're working on is a server API to allow a specialist provider to write reusable server consent processing logic that sits inside a server so that people can actually deploy consent management into the existing servers. As a community, particularly through Argonaut, we're working really hard on subscription to get subscription to be useful. So where I sit, having watched a lot of debates, if you're going to build working support for a clinical process, you really need, as a clinical systems vendor that owns record content, you need to support pull, push, and subscription. Push on demand, initiated by the sender. Subscription is push on demand initiated by the receiver, and pull is fetch on demand by the receiver. If you support all three of those things with a great deal of flexibility, then you can support a variety of clinical processes that people would like to implement. I've sat in a lot of rooms, a lot of architects trying to figure out how to do stuff with only two of those three legs, or only one of those. It doesn't work. And so all of you who own clinical record systems should be thinking in terms of we're going to be providing all three of them one way or another over time. We want to get custom resources properly supported. You can define them right now, but we haven't figured out some governance and operational parts of how would you get a custom resource supported in the community. Any of you who've used registry.fire.org know that it's not ready yet. We need to do work on that. I already talked about more cross-version support for FHIR and coming at the end of the day for that. We want to extend terminology service to seamlessly support CDA and V2. We're in the middle of trying to rework some of how capability statement works. In early August, I need to get technical corrections out for R2, R3 and R4 to fix all the things we know that are broken in the supporting infrastructure. So that's all about the snapshots, the value sets and the packages that support them. We won't actually be changing the standards themselves, except for some technical pointer stuff and documentation support stuff that we found that's wrong in release 4, but won't actually be issuing any like functional corrections to them. It's all technical corrections. And as part of that, we'll be reworking the way packages work. Any of you who are using packages at the moment, in early August, I'll completely reset the entire package infrastructure and the ecosystem. I talked about the pattern and definition work. I want to define a common observation pattern, which is a FHIR logical model, which is mapped through to version 2, CDA and FHIR and OpenAir, so that any profiles you write on the logical model can automatically be transformed to version 2 conformance statements, CDA templates, FHIR profiles, or OpenAir templates, so that one design of a observation use will operationalize across all of those systems. That's on my to-do list. We're currently working on moving all the terminology to a single terminology management within HL7. That's a very much HL7-ish thing. We need to get order and real and ordinal values associated with codes better handled. I'm working on a JavaScript mapping sandbox, which I'll be talking about when I talk about mapping from CDA in version 2 to FHIR. We're moving CDA implementation guide and the CDA spec itself over to a FHIR-based publishing framework. We need to finish off trying to get OpenAPI working seamlessly. We think we have implementation guides are all published with OpenAPI documents, but they don't actually work because of some very difficult but very obscure issues in JSON schema, which the JSON schema tools don't agree with each other about, and which OpenAPI just said, we don't do it that way. We're going to be non-conformant with the JSON schema, as if I didn't already have enough problems with JSON schema. And so I'm trying to get the OpenAPI community to pay attention to the fact that we can't use their we can't use schemas under their rules, or maybe we just don't understand their rules. I met with Amazon last week about that, and maybe Amazon can get a little bit of influence with the Open API community to actually look at that for us. And we have I have a bunch of tooling stuff to do around questionnaire and questionnaire response. So that's my personal to-do list. I thought you might find that interesting. All right, so summary, and then we have maybe 5, maybe 10 minutes for discussion, questions. So I hope you have plenty to say, because otherwise we'll be sitting here looking embarrassed. So, summary. Work on the core specification is now mainly about maturity of the specification and new domains. We've, as far as we know, we've done all the infrastructure in the specification. No one's running around going, you haven't got X or Y, and they're big pieces of work that we need to do. What people are running around going is, I don't really know how to fit this into some other piece of work that I'm doing. So it's all about integration, and the architecture side is all about integration, whether it's JSON schema or Open API or RDF or national ecosystems or so forth. We are adding new domains, but increasingly the new domains we're talking about are not core healthcare domains. We're talking, for instance, regulatory medication submissions, some other regulatory packaging and information. We're looking at population cohort definitions, possibly, guideline, evidence-based medicine guidelines. This is not what we think of currently as core clinical record keeping. I want to change that so that it is, but that's a longer term goal. Most of our focus then is moving towards implementation support and helping people make better use of FHIR, which is more implementation guides, a better ecosystem around them. And then our primary activity is actually hatching sub-communities. Hatching them and incubating them. I couldn't remember, do you incubate and then hatch, or hatch and incubate? It depends. And we kind of do both, but really we're at the point where we need to start creating sub-communities of interest around, and we have quite a few of those formed already, but lots more of them around domain-specific subjects, around refactoring healthcare processes, the way we've got Da Vinci, or growing the patient-consumer engagement to fill out. So far we've got a way for a consumer to get hold of some or all of their static record, but we need, how do they get data up? How do they correct the record? How do they manage access to their record? We've got a lot of work to do there, and at some point more of our work becomes hatching and supporting sub-communities than working on stuff ourselves. All right, so just to rehash, which Wayne covered in the introduction this morning, we set out to do 3 things: refactor healthcare IT standards. That's pretty much checked now. It's not complete, but it's pretty much happened. Even the specifications that are not FHIR, the organisations that maintain them, whether it's HL7 or IHE or others, have all said, we need to change the way we maintain standards. We need to be accountable in different ways than we have been. And we need to run differently as organisations. And that's the most significant change there. We wanted to refactor healthcare IT. We wanted to change the way the community and the ecosystem around healthcare IT hangs together. That is not done, but it's work in progress. But what we really want to do is change healthcare, and that has not yet really started to happen. There's going to be some really interesting and dramatic things in the next year and a half, but we really need to go a lot further than that. And so increasingly that's going to be, my goal is to clear off my checklist, which is all very IT stuff, and get more towards healthcare stuff. So it's a focus that's coming. All right. Any questions, comments? We're clearly going to run you around, Diego.
Here.
You can choose the sequence.
Yeah, one of the things that I've noticed in the current build, that you mentioned a little bit about in an August survey is that some things which are important to the kinds of things that I'm involved in are conditional create, conditional update. These are all trial use. How does one push for it in order to make sure that, you know?
The simplest and easiest way is to demonstrate the use in production systems. I don't think they will go to normative in release 5, but they could. An intermediary step is to propose that we have connectathon tracks either fully focused on them or connectathon tracks that depend on them to test them out.
Yeah, okay, all right. I mean, I'm just thinking of we definitely do use these in production, and our concern more is that they're going to disappear.
They're not going to disappear, but they just need more endorsement. They're not marked as trial use because we're trialling their existence. They're marked as trial use because they didn't meet our standards for saying done. And then going, it's broken, but we can't fix it. All right, next.
Could you talk a bit more about the package reset that's coming in August?
So for those of you who are interested in packages, which we're using NPM packages to distribute the computable forms of all of the specifications, and if you're really interested, we have a pop-up, informal pop-up tonight after the formal program's over, before we get kicked out. Currently, we agreed that the packages would be, the base packages would be HL7.5.core with a version number. But we realised a few weeks ago that we actually need to put the major release as a part of the identity of the package. So it'll be HL7.5.core.R4. Making that change invalidates every single package we've ever had. And so we need to do that, and so we're going to do that with the technical corrections and reset everything at the same time. And we may do some other changes around packages, which we'll be talking about tonight. All right, there was another one over there.
So my question was just about the bulk data API. What's the kind of the current status and future? And then I don't know if there's any sessions here at DevDays, but if there are, I would like to know about those.
So there's a session on the program itself for bulk data. So I am not aware of any directly bulk data related pop-ups being planned, only the formal session about bulk data. Josh? There's an import pop-up which is related to bulk data, yes, indeed. We don't know when that is though, do we? No. Not yet, we don't. So watch out for a pop-up about import, which is like the partner with bulk data export. We ballasted the document, reconciliations occurring, we expect to publish that. Do we have a particular expected publication date, Josh? No, well, on the current bulk data work. By September. And then I think most of all that will just migrate back to release 5, but we haven't formally committed to that yet, so it's only speculation. And then it'll just become part of the spec, although there may be some US specific advice that needs to live somewhere, that maybe a future version of US core. I know there's a lot of interest in bulk data, so we're very happy to have that landing. Okay, any other questions?
Hi, Graham. Since, at least in the United States, the 21st Century Cures Act has indicated that we'll have to support DSTU2 for a while per the specification, does R5 have any planning or towards end of life of old specifications of FHIR, especially non-normative ones, or at least the crosswalk of supporting multiple FHIR versions at the same time?
So there's NPRM that said release 2. My understanding is there was a significant amount of comment about the fact that NPRM said release 2. And I personally expect, not that I have any authority or vested interest, that it will actually come out saying something different after the amount of feedback. And one of the reasons it said release 2 is because some of the technical preconditions for it to say release 4 had not been met, but they will all have been met by us when the response to the NPRM is issued. So watch that space, it might change. To turn to release 5, both release 3 and release 4, I invested quite a bit of time on mapping between release 3 and 2 and 3 and 3 and 4. And I will talk a little bit about that when I talk about mapping between, which I think is the end of the day today, but it's a session this week sometime. You know how many sessions I've got, I can't remember when they are. And so other things, I have some funding to provision a JavaScript client for US core that is R2, R4 agnostic. So internally the client will be R4 and it'll just upgrade an R2 server if you connect to the R2 server. I've got some funding to do that. I'm still looking for a way to actually get it done. Discussions are ongoing on that. If you're interested in that, come talk to me. We otherwise come to my managing multiple FHIR versions, and we'll talk more about that. But in terms of end of life of R2, we agreed this morning that we would call end of life on R1. Anybody here using R1? No, I don't think so. We effectively end of life that a long time ago. And so we're actually going to formally end of life that. But you can be sure that the only reason we care about that is because we're going to formally end of life R2 at some point. I don't know when we'll be doing that. That'll be an interesting discussion. But clearly we're preparing the platform for that to happen. But actually there's nothing that we need to do in release 4 or 5 in order to end of life R2. It's an administrative process that lots of people will have an opinion about because it's a signal, but it has no technical meaning. We can end of life anything we want, but who cares? But we would not issue technical corrections. And I do have a technical correction to R2 in the pipeline for August, so it's not end of life yet.
I have a question about...
This will be the last question, by the way.
Evolution. I noticed in R4 that a number of new resource types were introduced for medications. And we know that LabCorp and Quest are still heavily invested in V2. Is HL7 as a group and an organization going to be involved in trying to influence labs to, say, use diagnostic report? And are we going to maybe think about getting pharmacies off of NCPDP and using some of the new medication advances in R4, R5?
So HL7, by our nature, is responsive to requests from the community, not the other way around. Vendors don't go off and do something because we ask them to, or we can persuade, but that's about it. Vendors do whatever they want. Regulatory authorities have to stick to world on that subject. So the real question is with them. Laboratories are held by regulation in most countries to version 2. And we have no influence over that. And they don't have any influence over that really either. So as long as the regulation holds them to version 2, they're not going to go to FHIR. How could that work? So really the question for that is there's twofold. There's regulation and there's just overwhelming market weight on a particular solution, neither of which we have any influence over. We do, what am I allowed to say here? You could look to see some forthcoming collaboration between HL7 and one of the bodies you mentioned sometime in the future. I think that's all I'm allowed to say. All right, thanks everybody. I've gone a little bit over time, but I started late, so I think that's okay. But we'll call it there.